The distance between staying broke forever and building real wealth is a lot smaller than you think. Shockingly smaller. In fact, for most people it comes down to a single number. $20,000. That's it. Not $1 million, not some secret hedge fund strategy, not a crypto miracle. 20,000. And here's the part nobody likes to admit out loud: your salary has almost nothing to do with whether you ever get there. I know that already sounds too simple, and that's exactly why almost no one in the financial industry wants to say it. Complexity sells. Confusion sells. If wealth were framed as arithmetic and behavior, a lot of very expensive advice would suddenly look unnecessary. And that would be bad for business, just not for yours. People are trained to believe that wealth is reserved for high earners, tech geniuses, or people who got lucky. That's comforting because it gives you an excuse. If it's about talent or timing, then failure isn't your fault. But that story is wrong. Completely wrong. The real divide isn't income. It's whether you ever cross a very boring, very unsexy threshold that almost nobody sticks around long enough to reach. And here's the cruel joke. The hardest part of building wealth happens when it looks like nothing is working. You're saving, you're sacrificing, and all you see is a sad little number inching up so slowly it feels insulting. That's the moment most people quit. They don't quit because they can't do it. They quit because they don't understand what comes next. So, let me ask you something, and don't answer too quickly. Why do so few people ever cross that first $20,000 mark? Not dream about it, not talk about it, actually cross it. And why does everything, your confidence, your options, your relationship with money, start to behave differently once you do? Because once you understand that shift, you can't unsee it. And if you can't unsee it, you stop sabotaging yourself right before the breakthrough. That's the part nobody warns you about. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about. Before you roll your eyes and think easy for you to say, "Kevin, you're rich," now, let me stop you right there. I've heard that line my entire life. And I understand why people say it. It's a convenient way to dismiss uncomfortable truths. If my words only apply to people who already made it, you don't have to listen. You don't have to change anything. You get to stay exactly where you are and call it realism. But that story falls apart the moment you look at where I actually started. I didn't grow up swimming in money. I earned a normal paycheck. I watched every dollar like it might run away if I blinked. I remember standing in grocery stores doing math in my head, deciding which items went back on the shelf. I know the feeling of climbing a financial mountain where every step feels pointless because the peak never seems to get any closer. You're exhausted, your legs burn, and you start wondering if the people ahead of you even started on the same mountain. I've been through divorce that wiped me out financially. I've buried a child. I've paid medical bills directly because insurance wasn't part of my world. I've walked city streets late at night, angry, exhausted, and scared, asking myself how the hell this became my life. And then I woke up the next morning and went back to work, not because I was inspired, but because there was no alternative. Rent doesn't care about your feelings, neither does the electric company. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. Sympathy is useless. It doesn't build anything. I'm telling you because hardship doesn't disqualify you from building wealth. It never has. In fact, hardship is common ground. Almost everyone who eventually succeeds goes through a stretch where quitting feels logical, reasonable, even responsible. Here's the uncomfortable part, and this is where people get defensive. Your circumstances matter, but they are not the deciding factor. They are not the question. The question is whether you are willing to do what those circumstances demand, whether you're willing to live below your means when it feels humiliating, whether you're willing to be patient while everyone around you looks like they're having more fun whether you can keep going when there's no applause and no visible progress. If you're waiting for conditions to be perfect before you start, you'll be waiting forever. I didn't win because life was fair. I won because I kept moving when stopping would have been easier. And that's the part most people don't want to hear, but it's the only part that actually matters. Let me tell you where almost everyone fails, because it's not where they think. It's not the market crash. It's not a bad boss. It's not a lack of intelligence. It's the beginning. The painfully boring, humiliating beginning where you're doing everything right and it feels like absolutely nothing is happening. You start saving a few $100s a month, maybe $400 if you're disciplined. You watch the number creep up month after month and it's laughable. At the end of the year, after all that sacrifice, you're staring at a balance that wouldn't even impress a used car salesman. And that's when the doubts start whispering. You skipped dinners out, you passed on vacations, you drove the old car. And for what? A number so small it almost feels like an insult. Meanwhile, everyone around you looks like they're winning. Your coworkers are posting beach photos. Your neighbor just bought a new SUV. Someone you went to school with is suddenly an entrepreneur on social media, flying business class and drinking cocktails you can't pronounce. And you're sitting there packing lunch in a brown paper bag, wondering if you're the only idiot in the room who doesn't know the secret shortcut. This is the moment that kills people financially, not because they're weak, but because their brain betrays them. Humans are wired to think in straight lines. If it took you a year to save $5,000, your mind automatically says, well, then 100,000 will take 20 years. And you do that math with a sense of dread, picturing yourself old, tired, and still waiting. So you quit. Or worse, you say you're quitting later and quietly start spending again to feel normal. What you don't see is the curve. And I mean that literally. Wealth doesn't grow in a straight line. It grows on an exponential curve, and the early part of that curve looks flat. So flat it feels like a cruel joke. You think nothing is happening because nothing is happening that you can feel. But the math is working. It's just working silently. This is where timing destroys people. They quit right before the slope changes, right before the money starts to compound in a way that's visible, right before progress finally feels real. It's like walking away from a rocket launch because the first few seconds weren't exciting enough. The explosion comes later, but only if you're still standing there. And let's be honest, the world doesn't make this easier. You're bombarded all day with reasons to stop. Ads telling you to enjoy life now. Friends asking why you're so cheap. A culture that celebrates spending as if it were success. Restraint doesn't get likes. Patience doesn't trend. Nobody applauds the person quietly building a foundation. So most people give up right here. Not because they can't succeed, but because they misread silence as failure. They confuse slow progress with no progress, and they never realize that this dull, frustrating, invisible phase is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. If you can survive this part without flinching, you separate yourself from 90% of the population without doing anything extraordinary at all. Let me be very clear about something, because this is where people misunderstand the entire point. $20,000 is not magic. There's no fairy dust on it. Nothing supernatural happens the moment your account hits that number. If you expect fireworks, you'll be disappointed. But what does happen is far more important, and it changes everything that comes after. The first change isn't mathematical, it's psychological. Before that point, you feel like someone who is trying to save money. After that point, you start to feel like someone who can save money. That sounds trivial, but it isn't. Identity drives behavior. Once you've proven to yourself that you can accumulate real capital even slowly, something clicks. You stop seeing yourself as fragile. You stop feeling like one small mistake will wipe you out. You sleep differently. and that alone is worth more than most people realize. There's also a new sense of safety that appears. You're no longer one car repair, one medical bill, one bad month away from disaster. That constant low-grade panic quiets down. You're not relaxed yet, but you're not desperate either. And desperation is expensive. Desperate people make stupid decisions. When you remove desperation, your judgment improves immediately. Now let's talk about the math, because this is where the shift becomes visible. With $1,000, even a decent return feels like nothing. 10% on $1,000 is $100. Congratulations, you bought groceries. No one feels motivated by that. But 10% on $20,000 is $2,000. Now you notice it. It shows up without you doing anything. That's the moment money starts to speak back to you. As the numbers grow, the conversation changes. At $50,000, the return starts to rival what you can save in a year. At $100,000, your money is working harder than you are. That's the crossover point. That's when effort begins to shift away from you and onto your capital. You're still contributing, but you're no longer carrying the entire load alone. Most people never experience this, not because it's unreachable, but because they quit before the handoff happens. They get tired of doing all the work while their money does nothing. They don't realize that this imbalance is temporary. It's supposed to feel unfair at first. That's the price of entry. And once you cross that line, something else changes that people don't talk about enough. Options start appearing. Opportunities that were invisible before suddenly come into focus. Partnerships, investments, choices that simply don't exist when you're living paycheck to paycheck. Capital attracts opportunity, not because the world is evil, but because money gives you flexibility. So when I say everything changes after $20,000, I don't mean your life turns into a movie montage. I mean your relationship with money shifts from survival to strategy, from fear to control, from hoping things don't go wrong to knowing you can handle it when they do. And once that shift happens, going back becomes very hard. Not because it's impossible, but because now you finally understand what you were building toward all along. Once you understand the math, the next question is uncomfortable because it forces you to stop blaming the outside world. Markets don't keep most people poor. Bad bosses don't. The economy doesn't either. Those things make it harder, sure, but they're not the real killers. The real damage is internal. And it usually comes from three places that don't announce themselves as enemies. The first one is impatience. This one destroys more financial futures than any recession ever has. People underestimate how long wealth takes, then overestimate how exciting the process should feel. They expect progress to be motivating every step of the way. It isn't. In the early years, delayed gratification feels less like discipline and more like punishment. So they crack. They raid the savings because they deserve a break. They upgrade the car, take the trip, buy the toy, tell themselves they'll get serious again later. And just like that, the seed corn is gone. They chose temporary relief over permanent progress, and the math never forgives that decision. The second enemy is envy, and this one is more subtle and more poisonous. Envy doesn't attack people who are failing. It goes after people who are actually doing okay. You've got a plan, you're saving, you're making progress. And then you look sideways. Someone else seems to be moving faster. Someone else bought a bigger house, a nicer car, took a better vacation. Suddenly, your perfectly good plan feels inadequate. So you abandon it to chase theirs. That's how people destroy themselves trying to keep up with illusions. You don't know their situation. You don't know their debt. You don't know how leveraged they are or how fragile their lifestyle really is. But envy doesn't care about facts. It only sees the surface. And the surface is designed to deceive. Social media is basically a highlight reel of bad financial decisions with good lighting. Yet people compare their long-term plan to someone else's staged moment and decide they're losing. That comparison has wrecked more wealth than bad investments ever will. And here's the dark humor of envy. It's the only vice that offers no pleasure at all. Gluttony at least comes with a meal. Lust comes with something enjoyable. Envy just makes you miserable while giving you nothing in return. It drains your energy, poisons your satisfaction, and pushes you toward decisions you wouldn't make if you kept your eyes forward. It's a complete waste of emotional bandwidth. The third enemy is self-pity, and this one is the most dangerous because it disguises itself as realism. Self-pity sounds reasonable. It says, "Given what I've been through, this isn't fair." And maybe it isn't, but self-pity paralyzes you. It turns action into resentment and effort into complaint. It pushes you toward passivity when progress demands motion. Left unchecked, it slides dangerously close to paranoia, where every setback becomes proof that the world is against you. And once you're there, nothing moves forward. Here's a mental tool that cuts through all of this, and almost nobody uses it. Instead of asking how to get rich, ask what would guarantee staying poor forever. Spend more than you earn. Save nothing. Carry high-interest debt. Act on envy. Quit when things feel slow. Feel sorry for yourself and wait for conditions to improve. If you do those things consistently, poverty is nearly assured. The strategy then becomes embarrassingly simple. Don't do them. I'm not trying to be brilliant. I'm trying to not be idiotic. That's it. Most people are so focused on being clever that they ignore the obvious behaviors that quietly ruin them over time. Wealth doesn't require genius. It requires avoiding a handful of self-inflicted wounds long enough for compounding to work. Once you see these enemies for what they are, something shifts. You stop looking for villains outside yourself. You don't beat yourself up, but you also stop lying to yourself. And that's where real progress starts. Not with motivation, not with inspiration, but with the uncomfortable realization that the biggest obstacle was never the system. It was the voice in your own head convincing you to quit compare or feel sorry for yourself right when discipline mattered most. So let me answer the question people are usually afraid to ask out loud. Why bother with all of this? Why save weight, sacrifice, and delay gratification? If the goal were just to buy nicer stuff, it wouldn't be worth it. Fancy things wear out. Cars get boring, houses need repairs, and chasing status is a game you never win because someone will always have more than you. If that's why you want money, you're going to be disappointed. The real reason to build wealth is freedom. That's it. Freedom is the dividend. When you don't have money, your life is reactive. You take the job you can get, not the one you want. You tolerate conditions you hate because the paycheck has leverage over you. You say yes when you want to say no, and you pretend it doesn't bother you. That's not independence. That's compliance. Capital changes that relationship. Not overnight and not dramatically, but steadily. Once you have a cushion, you can wait. Waiting is an underrated superpower. You can walk away from bad deals. You can turn down opportunities that don't feel right. You can survive a rough patch without panic. And panic is what forces people into terrible decisions. After that first $20,000, something subtle but profound happens. You stop feeling like a victim of circumstances. You're not immune to problems, but you're no longer trapped by them. A broken car becomes an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. A job loss becomes a setback, not an existential crisis. You gain the ability to choose your responses instead of reacting out of fear. And here's the part nobody tells you. Money doesn't just buy comfort. It buys time. Time to think, time to learn, time to say, this isn't right for me, and wait for something better. It allows you to play a longer game. And in life, the people who can play the long game usually win. I didn't pursue wealth because I wanted toys. I pursued it because I wanted independence. I didn't want to beg for permission to live my life on my own terms. I wanted the ability to walk away when walking away was the right decision. That's what money does at its best. It removes desperation from your thinking. So when I say everything changes after $20,000, I'm not talking about luxury. I'm talking about authorship. Before that point, circumstances are writing your story. After that point, you start holding the pen. And once you realize that's possible, it becomes very hard to justify not trying. Not because it's easy, but because now you understand what's actually at stake.